One of the things that we spend some time talking about occasionally on Sunday mornings and even in our Bible studies is the relevancy and the importance of reading the Old Testament, studying the Old Testament as well as the New. And part of the reason for that is the Old Testament really represents God revealed to us, His nature, who He is, how He thinks, we'll say in human terms, how He acts, that sort of thing. And the Old Testament also, much more than the New Testament, accounts and describes how God interacts with His people. And kind of the inverse of that, it also describes how God's people interact with Him. And interestingly, as you dig into the Old Testament, we see and we learn that really from almost the beginning of time, people have had the same struggles and the same challenges in following God that we do today. You know, they got caught up with what was going on around them, with their jobs, with their social lives, and they would slowly, over the course of days or weeks or months and years, they would slowly drift away from God. And what we see in the Old Testament is, as those stories are told, we also see how God would reach out to them and kind of bring them, or attempt to bring them back into His fold. Sometimes it was through real significant revelation and almost a miraculous turnaround back to God. And many times, though, it was through God's justice that He would bring them back. It was through means that we don't necessarily associate or attribute to God. It would be through maybe one nation conquering another. It would be through utter devastation and destruction as God essentially punished His people that would not return to Him. But through that, through our study of the Old Testament, we can also learn how God interacts with us today, as well as His desires for us today in 2013. And we also learn how we can and how we should interact with God ourselves and respond to Him, even when maybe we've drifted away. And so today, I want to take a look at Habakkuk, or Habakkuk is another pronunciation. They're both universally accepted, so pronounce it whichever way is more fun as you talk about it. But Habakkuk was one of what we consider biblically one of the minor prophets. And as a reminder, that doesn't mean that he was any less important than the major prophets. It just means that his writing, as biblical writing, is shorter. And in this case, much, much shorter. Now, Habakkuk, the man himself, we know very, very little about him. But what we do know is that he served as a prophet during a very difficult time in the history of God's people. He served as a prophet when the kingdom was split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Judah. And he was from Judah, and he was raised, grew up, and served in the southern kingdom, lived in the southern kingdom, lived in Judah. And at that point in time, part of the reason the kingdom was split is because of the evil and the hard-heartedness that had grown in the hearts of God's people. So there was really a political split several years before this time, but their disobedience to God had continued on, and it was something that had grown worse and worse. And I want to take just a few minutes and describe what that disobedience to God looks like. Because a lot of times when we look at the Bible and we look at the biblical peoples, the societies, and we look at disobedience to God, we think of terrible things, right? We think of them worshiping false idols in the form of like a golden calf and that sort of thing, which is true, but it's more relatable to us today than maybe what we realize. The societies like Judah in this case, the way that they were disobedient to God was they started to value their own life and their own desires and their own needs as more important than God's. In other words, they were caught up in making money. They were busy with their social life. They had gotten to a point in society that as an ideology and a political stance, that other behaviors outside of God's will were being accepted and were very much a part of their culture. Things like certain types of sexual immorality, things like false religions, things like no religion at all, God isn't real at all, it's just all about me on this earth and how much I can gain for myself. So when we look at the kingdom of Judah, it doesn't sound too far removed from the United States and other countries in 2013. It's very similar. We spend a lot of our time focused more on our bank account than we do on God's Word. And we spend more time working or enjoying time in our social circles and with our social friends than we do with our church family. And we spend maybe more time focused on other things in life than God. And so while we may not have a statue of an idol that's more important to us than God, many times we do, if we're being honest with ourselves, have very real things, efforts, ideas, things that consume our time, things that consume the desires of our heart that we place more important than God. So where Judah was back in 600 BC is not too different from a thought process, from a spiritual condition, than where the United States is today in 2013. And so the book of Habakkuk is essentially Habakkuk's prayer journal as he served God as the prophet to Judah during this very difficult point in time. And so as we look at the book of Habakkuk and Habakkuk's experience, we learn a few very important and very significant lessons that may, for some of us, change how we ourselves think of God and how we interact with God. And so the first lesson that we're going to look at and talk about that we learn from Habakkuk is that prayer, our prayer life, it's a dialogue. It's a two-way conversation with God. If you think about how we practice prayer today, individually and collectively, we have kind of a formal structure that we follow, which has some good reasons behind it, but also makes it just kind of odd in terms of a conversation, right? And we petition God with our requests, what we're looking for, what we're asking, maybe what we're thinking or what we're feeling. And we say amen, and we go on about our business. Do any of you do that in conversation? When you're talking with somebody, do you just walk up to somebody and say, well, I'd like this and this and this and this. See you later, bye. And turn around and walk away. Do any of us do that in conversation? I hope not. Probably not. But that's exactly how we practice our prayer life. And Habakkuk, by example, shows us that, you know what, that's not the way it's intended to be. Prayer, by its actual definition, is our conversation, our communication with God. Now, if God is supreme in our life, what do you think is more important? Our words or His words? It's His words that we need to hear, that we need to guide us and direct us. And so as we look at Habakkuk, his prayer journal that's documented as the book of Habakkuk, to give you a little bit of an outline, there's 3 chapters in Habakkuk. And so if we look at the book as a whole, the first 4 verses is Habakkuk praying. Okay? The next 6 verses is God's response. And then the next 6 verses is Habakkuk's response. And then following that, God talks for what's documented as 18 verses. And then Habakkuk responds and kind of ends the conversation with 18 verses. So in case you weren't keeping track, That's about a 50-50 conversation. Habakkuk was talking half of the time, and God was talking verbally half of the time to Habakkuk. Okay? Now think about, how does that compare to your prayer life today? How does that compare to your prayer life? I know if I compare my prayer life against that, it looks really different. Really different. I can tell you there are times when I pray that I sense and I feel a real communication from God as a response. But if I were to weigh that in terms of percentage, it would look probably a whole lot more like 95% of me talking and 5% of God communicating with me. And maybe that's being a little bit generous for myself there. But Habakkuk shows us that if we want true communion with God, we have to understand that prayer is a two-way street. It's a two-way line of communication. And so as we go to God in prayer, we can and we should look for, expect, and wait for God's answer. Jesus taught, as a matter of fact, that Jesus said, and it's documented in the Gospel of John, "If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you." What Jesus is saying here, contrary to what many people believe, isn't the latter part. Ask for whatever you want, it'll be given to you. That's not what Jesus is saying. But what Jesus is saying is, if you spend time with Him and allow Him and His words written in the Bible, spoken, communicated to us through the Holy Spirit, if we allow His words and His communication to abide in us, in other words, if our communication with God is two-way, if we're listening for God just as much or maybe more than we're talking to Him, if we do that, then we can ask for whatever we wish and it'll be given to us. And the reason for that is, if that's the nature of our relationship with God, number one, we're going to be living in submission to Him. Number two, we're so going to understand His will and His desire and His plan that our will and our desire and our plan becomes the same as His. And so it's no problem for God to grant us what we're asking for if what we're asking for is what He has planned for us. So what Jesus is saying is, if you spend time in developing and establishing this perfect relationship with God, this perfect communication with God, if you do that, then anything that you ask will be given to you because it's God's will for you. And so as we move on, looking at Habakkuk's experience and his time in prayer with God, there's a second important lesson that may, for some of you, or maybe all of you, may completely redefine your prayer life and how you experience God. And what we learned from Habakkuk, the second lesson that we learned from Habakkuk, is that it is okay, it is acceptable to question God. And let me clarify before somebody overreacts and thinks that I'm saying nonsense. It's not okay to question God's authority. It's not okay to question God's divine nature. It's not okay to question His supremacy in our life and His importance and His significance. And it's not okay to question His commands. But it is okay to question God in terms of why He's doing what He is doing. If we look at the specific situation that Habakkuk was in, Habakkuk was serving, remember, as a prophet to the kingdom of Judah who had completely turned their back from God and had shifted over to focusing on their own desires over God's desires and God's plan. And this had been this way for several hundred years at this point. And God had appealed to His people through several prophets that had come along before Habakkuk. God had spoken to His people through those prophets in an attempt to get the people to turn back to Him and follow Him again. And they didn't. They just continued on in their sinful condition. And so a little bit before Habakkuk's time, the prophet Jeremiah learned and heard from God that it was God's plan and God's intent that the kingdom of Judah would, due to their disobedience, would be destroyed by Babylon. Now, historically speaking and politically speaking, Babylon at this point in time was a rising world power that was just conquering kingdom after kingdom and city after city and nation after nation. And as much as God talked about, and the Bible tells us, that Judah had turned away from him, the people of Babylon had never had a relationship with God. And they truly were, if we were to call somebody an evil people, they truly were an evil people. They were almost barbaric in their military tactics. They were almost they were inhumane even in the way that they treated people as they captured cities and nations and that sort of thing. And their sole focus, their sole agenda as a nation of Babylon was simply to essentially rule the world, to take over other countries, to dominate other peoples. That was their sole purpose, their sole agenda. So they were very barbaric and cruel and evil in the way that they did things. And so Habakkuk, as we see in his prayer journal, and we'll look at specifically in a moment, Habakkuk has some questions for God. He's wondering why God's plan is to eliminate the nation of Judah, take the nation of Judah from a pretty strong, economically and politically strong land and completely destroy them in terms of their own independence. And why is God going to do that? And Habakkuk also wanted to know, why was God going to use probably the most evil people in the world at that point in time as his tool to bring the nation of Judah, the people of Judah, back into God's fold? And so let's take a look for a moment at what Habakkuk said. And I want to tell you this morning, if you want to turn there, first off, Habakkuk is right near the end of the Old Testament. It's so short, probably the quickest way is to use your table of contents to get there. And we're going to take a look at Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. But I want to tell you, this morning I'm reading from the Message translation. And I've got to explain why a little bit. And the reason for that is, like many of the prophets, Habakkuk's writing is Jewish poetry. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't get along with poetry very well. I tend not to understand it or not enjoy it or simply not read it. But to make matters worse, it's poetry in the Jewish language, not so much in the English language, perhaps. So the Message is a more modern translation that really kind of says this in words that that I can understand anyway. So what Habakkuk wrote, and listen to his questions here, but what Habakkuk wrote in this portion is his questions for God. Habakkuk said, "God, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen? How many times do I have to yell, 'Help, murder, police,' before you come to the rescue? Why do you force me to look at evil, stare trouble in the face day after day? Anarchy and violence break out, quarrels and fights all over the place. Law and order falls to pieces. Justice is a joke. The wicked have the righteous hamstrung and stand justice on its head." So essentially what Habakkuk is saying to God, and we have to read it and understand it with the right attitude. Here's a man of God that is expecting his nation, his people, to be destroyed by an evil nation with the knowledge that this is God's will and God's plan. So we look at Habakkuk's questions, and we have to understand that Habakkuk's not sitting there very formally in prayer saying, "Dear Lord, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen?" That's not what Habakkuk's saying. He's saying, "God, why is this happening? Why is this your plan?" That's the spirit, that's the attitude that Habakkuk is approaching God with in prayer. He has his true emotion showing in his communication with God. He's not trying to make it a flowery sounding prayer. he has that strength of a relationship with God, that strength of a prayer life with God, that he's coming to him in honesty with all of his raw emotion, asking these questions. Asking, God, why is this your plan? Why is your plan destruction? Why is there evil all around me, but yet your answer to it is more evil? And as he asks those questions, he's expecting answers. So for us today, we can go to God with our questions about his plan and his will for our life when we don't understand it. When we look at what's going on in our own life, if it's the loss of a loved one, or financial destruction, or a hard time at work, or just things aren't going right no matter what you do, we can go to God and ask him why and expect answers. In fact, we should go to him and ask him why and expect answers. And because Habakkuk did that for himself, God did answer him. God answered him directly, as a matter of fact. And part of God's answer brings us to lesson number 3 that we learn from Habakkuk and his experience and his time in prayer with God. Lesson number 3 is that we have to have faith. Sometimes the only answer is faith. We think about, most of us here are parents or grandparents, or have spent enough time with small children that we understand this truth. Kids have questions, and they expect answers, right? We can probably all mentally rewind to a time where a small child was asking us questions like, well, why does that cloud look like that? Or, why is the grass green? Why is the sky blue? Those questions that are kind of tough to answer, right? And then, maybe a little bit older, kids get into this pattern of everything that you say. But why? But why? But why? And, as frustrating as it can be, sometimes, the kids are looking to us as adults and people in authority in our life and their lives, and they're asking us those questions because they have the faith that we have the answer. They believe that we have the answer to those questions. And so we can learn from that, but also we know from our own experience that sometimes the answer is simply, because I said so. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes that's the best answer we can give. It may be because the question that small child is asking us is the answer to that is one that they can't understand, right? They don't have the knowledge or the experience, life experience yet to understand. Or it may simply be because I said so. And so it's much the same way with God, right? Sometimes our experience with him and the questions that we ask him, if he were to answer, we simply could not understand. Like, more or less, in the case of Habakkuk's situation with facing the destruction of his nation. Habakkuk, nor any person at that point in time, could not fully understand God's purpose and God's plan in that. So God couldn't give him a complete answer. And part of God's conversation as a result with Habakkuk was, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. So God, in part of his answer to Habakkuk's questions about why was this going to happen, part of God's answer was, you know what? This comes down to faith. Either you trust me or you don't. And if you're righteous, if you're truly serving God and you're truly in a relationship with him, and you're truly surrendered to his will, and you're truly striving to be and live as holy and as pure and perfect as possible, the righteous will accept this by faith. The righteous will accept that, you know what? Sometimes God's answer is because I said so. And that's it. And we just say, okay, and move on. We don't say, but why? Or we don't keep on arguing with God. Sometimes we accept that it's just because he said so. So we have to live by faith. The writer, the author of the book of Hebrews, says that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And if we think about that and apply it to God's will, God's plan, the work that God does in our individual lives, in our community, in our society, this makes a lot of sense, right? Our faith in God really drives the things that we're hoping for. Well, hopefully it's our faith in God that's driving that anyway. Our faith in something is driving what we're hoping for. Hopefully it's our faith in God. And faith is also the evidence, the comfort, the knowledge, the trust that we have in something that we haven't necessarily seen in the case of God. There's a pastor of a church out in California, and he's on some TV stations, he's on the radio. You may have heard of him. His name is David Jeremiah. And a couple of weeks ago, he shared a story that so well explains faith in terms that we can understand. And the story goes like this. Suppose it's, we'll say, late December, and you go out to the lake, and you see that the lake is iced over. Now you can decide for yourself that you are going to walk across that lake. And you're confident in this, and you're sure of this, and you're absolutely certain. And you take the first couple of steps, and you hear some cracking underneath your feet. But you're still certain you're going to make it across the lake. A couple more steps, and your feet start to get wet. But you're still certain that you're going to make it across the lake. And one more step, and you fall through. Now, in that moment, you had all the faith in the world that you were going to accomplish what you set out to do. You were certain that you were going to walk across that lake. But it didn't happen. Now, we'll kind of advance in the future about 6 weeks to maybe this time of year, or middle of February anyway. And we go out to that same lake, and we've learned our lesson. We were cold and wet last time, and we thought, you know what, that wasn't such a good idea. That could have been really bad. And so we go out to the lake this time, and we look out there, and we see ice fishing shanties and a couple of trucks and four-wheelers out there and that sort of thing. And we decide that, well, I probably shouldn't, but maybe I'll walk out there a little ways. And as we do it, as you stand at the bank, where the land meets the water, the ice, you're thinking of what happened a few weeks ago when you fell through the ice. And you're not sure what's going to happen this time. But you decide to take that first step. Nothing happens. You take another step. Nothing happens. Not a crack, not a sound, not a noise. And you're not sure if you should turn around and go back while you're still dry or not. And the difference is, and you look at those two experiences. The first time, you had a tremendous amount of faith. The second time, you had very little faith. But the difference between the two was the object of your faith. The first time, you had faith that ice was going to support you, and you're going to be able to walk across that lake. But it failed you. The second time, you didn't have much faith. But the object, the ice, was solid. It was sturdy. It could support you. It could support a truck. It could support a whole lot more than that. So even though you had a little bit of faith, it worked out much better because the object of your faith was solid. So as we think about that this morning and apply it to our own lives, what is our faith in? Is our faith in our own abilities? Is our faith in our own will, our own desires? Is our faith in the people that are around us? If so, you're going to be disappointed in life. Or is our faith in God? Is our faith in something solid, something we can stand on, something that can hold much more than ourselves? Is our faith in God something solid we can believe in? There's a big difference there. And the other thing that comes along with that is, the more we know about the object of our faith, the more we know about God, the more that we grow in faith. In other words, when we look at that analogy of the icy lake, we didn't know much about the thin ice, really. All we knew is we were going to go across it. And it didn't hold us, but we had quite a bit of faith in ourselves and our own ability. But if we look at, a few weeks later when the lake was much more solid and had maybe a couple of feet of ice on it, and we stepped out onto that lake, we had very little faith. But we had the opportunity to look around and see that, there's a truck out there, and there's a couple of ice fishing shanties, and there's four-wheelers out there, and there's other people way out there. And so as we apply that to our own walk with God, we can look at the people that are living around us, the faithful people that are living around us. And number one, learn that God is a good place to place our faith because it works out well for other people. And number two, we have the opportunity to get into God's Word and study and understand more about Him, the object of our faith. And the more that we know about Him, the easier it is to trust Him with every aspect of our life. Not just Sunday mornings, but with every single aspect of our life. The more we know about Him, the easier it is. The more we know about the ice that we're going to step out on, the easier it is to know whether or not we're going to fall through and get wet. And so, God's response to Habakkuk was, in many words, you got to have faith. Either you trust me or you don't. This may not make sense to you, Habakkuk, but my plan's much bigger than the next few months or the next few years. And trust me, the Babylonians will meet their destruction. They'll get what they deserve. And also, trust me, that through this, the people of Judah will begin to come back into the fellowship, begin to come back into the fold. So God told Habakkuk, just trust me. This is a matter of faith. Now, if you remember, when I kind of broke out the outline of the dialogue between Habakkuk and God, Habakkuk's story, Habakkuk's prayer journal, closes with his response to God. And I want to share with you the last few verses of what Habakkuk wrote. Habakkuk says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. So Habakkuk's response, his closing words in this conversation that he had with God, was simply, God, even if it's bad, I'm going to rejoice in you. No matter how bad it gets, I'm going to rejoice in you. I'm going to be joyful in your presence. I'm going to be joyful in your salvation. You are my strength, God. And so as we look at Habakkuk's response, we can learn from that for ourselves as well, too. That even when it doesn't make sense, even when God's answer is essentially, because I said so, we accept that. And we say, you know what, God, I trust you. You're the object of my faith. My faith is placed in you, and because of that, I'm going to rejoice. I'm going to be joyful. So today, as we think about our own lives and our own experience, whatever you're facing, whatever difficult situation you may be facing, whatever difficult situation you may face down the road, we need to remember to try to be like Habakkuk. We need to remember that prayer is indeed our dialogue with God, not just our wish list. He's not a genie in a bottle for us to say, I'd really like this, and expect it to happen. He's the God that we serve. He's more important than us. His way, His desires are more important than ours. And we should be ready to hear what He has to say. And we should also remember that we can seek answers from God, that we should seek answers from God. Yes, through prayer, like Habakkuk did. But unlike Habakkuk, we have the advantage of the entirety of God's revelation in His Bible. The entirety of how God has revealed Himself to His people in our Bible, in written word, that any of us, in the United States anyway, can lay hands on in an actual book form or electronically, just about anywhere we're at. So, we can go to God and seek answers. And we can find answers, like I said, not only in prayer, but we can find answers in His Word. I don't know about you, but one thing that really drives me nuts is having to repeat myself. My kids will tell you that all the time, that if they ask a question and I answer it, they might get me to repeat once more. After that, that's it. They're done. I tell them, what do I say, Nate? If you're going to ask a question, be ready to hear the answer, right? Yeah. So, it's kind of, I'm sure God is much more that way than I am. God's already said it. We need to understand, and we need to look for His answers already provided for us. And go to Him in prayer, too. And then sometimes, whatever we're facing, the difficulty that we're facing, is we try to understand that as we try to make sense of what's going on in life around us. Sometimes we just need to accept it as a matter of faith. That for whatever reason, even though I don't understand, or why my bank account is always at zero, and my gas gauge is always on empty, and I just, barely make it from paycheck to paycheck, and every time the phone rings, it's bad news, and every time I go to work, somebody has something nasty to say to me, and my friends don't want to talk to me, and my family doesn't want to talk to me. We need to understand that, maybe this is just God's plan. Maybe it's His way of drawing us closer to Him. Sometimes we just have to accept it as a matter of faith.